Today we continue in the story of Genesis with Isaac and Rebekah. Isaac, who is Abraham's son. You notice in the past weeks and months that a lot of pages, a lot of pen and ink are given to the story of Abraham in Genesis. But you will notice the story of Isaac's life is much shorter. For the next couple weeks we will learn more about Isaac, but his stories are really the purpose of the stories about Isaac in Genesis are to prepare the way for his son Jacob, who we will see born today. The remaining chapters of Genesis, you'll see as we continue our study, focus heavily on Jacob and his sons. You see, Jacob, who is born today, will later be renamed by God. His name will be Israel. Jacob will have 12 sons who will become the 12 tribes of Israel. Growing into a great big nation, you see already God's promise to Abraham to make Israel big, strong nation is coming to fruition. Today we see in the birth of Isaac and Rebekah's sons, we see the birth of Jacob and Esau. And before we dive into that story, I want you to lean in for a moment and get the big idea of today's story. Main idea, we see that the author's intent, what the author wants you to get from this, is to lift your eyes to a higher view of God. You see, we often worship far too small a God. He is creator of all things. He is all powerful. God is all knowing. He is in all places at all times. The word that comes from God's mouth never fails. He said, "Let there be light," and there was light. He is God. And the author wants you to know that. He is high and big and mighty. And just to endure this life that we live today, we need a high and mighty view of our God, right? We need to know and we need to remember, main idea here is that God's sovereign grace is at work in your life. In this Thanksgiving season, we should be thankful for these truths. In terms of God's sovereignty, we should be thankful that God is in control of all things. I am not in control. You are not in control. No one else is. God is sovereign over his creation. And in terms of the grace of God, we should be thankful then that God exercises that sovereign power in grace toward you, his people, in loving kindness, mercy, and grace. Christian, in the mountains and in the valleys of this life, you can trust that God is sovereign. He is with you and he is in control. And you can trust that God works that power in gracious mercy to you. Today's passage teaches us of this sovereign grace of God. Look at verses 19 through 26. We'll see two short stories today. First, we will read of the birth of Esau and Jacob in verses 19 through 26. If you'll follow with me as I read, and I misspoke, we'll continue through to the end of the chapter. Before we close, we will look at Esau selling his birthright to Jacob. So follow me now, verses 19 through 26. These are the generations of Isaac, Abraham's son. Abraham fathered Isaac, and Isaac was 40 years old when he took Rebekah, the daughter of Bethuel, the Aramean of Paddan Aram, the sister of Laban, the Aramean, to be his wife. And Isaac prayed to the Lord for his wife, because she was barren. And the Lord granted his prayer. And Rebekah, his wife, conceived. The children struggled together within her, and she said, "If it is thus, why is this happening to me?" So Rebekah went to inquire of the Lord. And the Lord said to her, "Two nations are in your womb, and two peoples from within you shall be divided. The one shall be stronger than the other. The older shall serve the younger." When her days to give birth were completed, behold, there were twins in her womb. The first came out red, all his body like a hairy cloak. So they called his name Esau. Afterward, his brother came out with his hand holding Esau's heel. So his name was called Jacob. Isaac was 60 years old when Rebekah bore them. May the Lord bless the reading and the preaching of his word today. God's sovereign grace is at work in the lives of his people. Those are two big terms. We'll start with a couple of definitions. One, God's sovereignty is his powerful control over all the events of the world, of the universe. That's his sovereignty. He is sovereign over all things. Put simply, God is in fact God. God's grace is the undeserved favor that he extends to his people. So he is sovereign over all things, powerful, and he works that sovereignty, his power in grace toward us. And church, this is good news for us. We should find great comfort and great confidence in this life with the sovereign grace of God at our backs. In this first story, we see God's sovereign grace in our prayers. We see God's sovereign grace in our salvation. And we will see thirdly, as we move to close, that we need God's sovereign grace. So at the start of this story, we see God's sovereign grace in our prayers. Starting in verses 19 and 20, if you will look there, we get more of this transition by way of genealogy, which traces the line of Abraham to Isaac, as well as the genealogy of Rebekah's family tracing to herself, mentioning her father and her brother. This then sets the scene for the story of Isaac and Rebekah beginning today. And here it begins in verse 21. Look closely at verse 21. Isaac prayed to the Lord for his wife because she was barren. And the Lord granted his prayer, and Rebekah, his wife, conceived. So if you remember, just as Sarah, Abraham's wife, was unable to have children, so was Rebekah. During this time, the success of people was judged by the size of their families, the amount of children they had. So the worldly, sinful men of this time had a great idea of going to polygamy. Multiple wives to have more children, more power in the eyes of the world. If you remember, Isaac was born into a similar circumstance. Abraham had a child with Hagar, the servant of Sarah. So it is not reading too much in the lines here, between the lines here, to say that Isaac's monogamy, his faithfulness to Rebekah, and her inability to have children, is a reaction to his own previous experience when he saw the sorrow, the sadness that Abraham's sinful relationship with Hagar brought into their home. Isaac remembers that. It's probably traumatic from his childhood. So here when Isaac discovers that Rebekah is barren, unable to have children, rather than take up the ways of the world and go to another woman, what does Isaac do? He prays. He prays for his wife. He takes their problem to the Lord. We can learn much from this, Christian. When a problem arises in your life, we are to first take our problem to the Lord. Before moving to solve a problem on your own or resorting to sin to solve a problem, something that you need early and often, cast your burdens on the Lord. Bow yourself before the throne of God in prayer. The God who is, yes, sovereign, mighty, powerful over all the universe, yet listens to your prayer. Rebekah is barren. Here you have also the example of Isaac praying for children. Perhaps it is you or someone you know who wishes to have children. What should you do? Pray for the father's provision as Isaac did. And he may be pleased to provide just as he does here. Maybe it's not a child, but something else you need. We are to persistently, consistently petition the Lord in prayer. And as long as our desires align with the glory and will of God, he is pleased to provide. Isaac also provides an incredible example of praying for his wife. Husbands in the room, as spiritual leader of the home, we are to pray for our family. Pray with our family. We know our wives, what do they want? They want love, right? Romance. That's what women want. I will note that the best way you can make your love known to your wife is to pray with your wife. Ladies in the room, watch Rebekah. Continuing in verse 22, she conceived, and the children then struggled within her. What did Rebekah do? Look at the end of verse 22. She went to inquire of the Lord. Rebekah also took her problem to the Lord in prayer. So there you see good positive examples from Isaac and Rebekah. But here also, you also see the sovereign grace of God in our prayers. Christian, it is by God's grace that he stoops down from his mighty heavenly throne to attentively listen to every word you utter to him. That is the grace of God. And it is by God's grace that he answers your prayers. And he so often does. And in God's sovereignty, he is the one, and he is the only one who is able to answer the prayer. He is able to grant the request. Here in verse 21 is the perfect example of God's sovereign grace in our prayers. Look at Isaac's prayer and God's swift answer. Look at verse 21 one more time. Isaac prayed to the Lord for his wife because she was barren. Look how quick. And the Lord granted his prayer, and Rebekah, his wife, conceived. God did not have to do this for Isaac and Rebekah. This is a picture of God's grace. Yet God caused a otherwise barren Rebekah to conceive at the power of his word. This is a picture of God's sovereignty. So in the examples of Isaac and his wife Rebekah, God is sovereignly gracious in our prayers. Before we move ahead to the next verses, let me just ask you, Christian man, woman, individual, you in your chair today, do you pray? Do we take God up at this? He is all powerful. He has what it takes to answer the prayer. And he is gracious, loving, willing to provide. We should take God up on his sovereign grace and pray and pray and pray. Christian, do you pray? This story also teaches God's sovereign grace in our salvation. Rebekah is unable to have a child, so Isaac prays and God provides. Verse 22 then reveals to us that there are multiple children in Rebekah's womb, and they are struggling within her. Maggie, with just one baby in the womb, had enough struggle. The baby flipping, turning, doing gymnastics in there. So I can imagine, with twins in the womb, sending Rebekah here to prayer. Rebekah, verse 22 says, "Why is this happening to me?" So she went to inquire of the Lord. Here again, God in his grace answers Rebekah very quickly. Verse 23, look at verse 23. And note in Scripture, when God speaks, there's a direct quotation of God in the Bible. It is important. Verse 23 here is the anchor of today's passage. Look here. The Lord said to her, "Two nations are in your womb, and two peoples from within you shall be divided. The one shall be stronger than the other. The older shall serve the younger." Here in God's response to Rebekah, he reveals that this struggling within her womb is more than just a physical matter, but a foreshadow of larger struggles to come, both personally and nationally. We see both that personally from the womb, Jacob and Esau struggling together is a foreshadow of them two as brothers not getting along from birth. And we will see this today. Nationally, the Edomites, who are the descendants of Esau, and the Israelites, the descendants of Jacob, clash repeatedly, often at odds. So God answers Rebekah to say this struggling within your womb is a foreshadowing of the conflict between baby Jacob and Esau, the two men you will birth. But there is a much deeper point that God makes in this verse. Look at the last two phrases of verse 23. God says, "The one shall be stronger than the other. The older shall serve the younger." Now, you know, common sense, that it would be natural for the firstborn son to be the leader, heir of the family. And it would be natural here in the story of the Bible for the firstborn son to be the one through which God continues his blessing to make Israel into a great nation. You also know God does not often does not work in terms of what is easiest, normal, or most natural. God declares here to Rebekah in those final two phrases of verse 23 that the older son will serve the younger, backwards in terms of what would be normal in this culture. We see in the next few verses, we read that Jacob comes out after Esau. So Jacob is the younger son. So what God is saying here to Rebekah is that Jacob will be the one who receives the inheritance of their father, Isaac, and Jacob will be the one who receives the blessing of God to continue the line to Jesus in making Israel into a great nation. God will continue his promise to Abraham through Jacob. That's what God says to her here in short. Here we see that by his sovereign grace, God declared that the promised line would belong to Jacob, the younger son. Jacob thus owed his position as the heir of the blessing of God, as the future father of the 12 tribes of Israel, not to natural order, not to human will, but to the working of God alone. Put simply, why would God's blessing continue through Jacob, the younger son? Because God, in his sovereign grace, decreed it so. Now, what does God's working through Jacob in this way have to do with you or me? Just as with Jacob, God is sovereignly gracious in your life, in your salvation. Now, turn that question to us today. Why are you a Christian? Why are you in the church today? Because God, by his sovereign grace, has risen you from dead in sin to alive by faith in Jesus. I had a good conversation with Taylor earlier this week that helps us here, I believe. If you ever want good Bible talk to Taylor and Jamie, I'm sure. You may get a lot of his ideas from her. But I think this helps us here, Taylor, if you don't mind me sharing. He brought up a good question. Imagine at your death, approaching the throne of God, and God actually turns the question to you and asks, why should you get to enter heaven? Why should I let you into heaven? What would your response to God be? What would your answer to this question be? You would not say, rather you should not say, God, you will let me into heaven because I went to church most Sundays. You should not say, God, you will let me into heaven because I'm a pretty good person. You would not say, God, you will let me into heaven because my parents went to church. The only right response would be to say, God, I get into heaven because Jesus died for me. This is the sovereign grace of God in your salvation. By His grace, love and mercy and His grace, He sent Jesus to live the life you could not live and to die the death that you deserve. And by His sovereign power, He raised Jesus from the dead, defeating the sting of sin, of pain, and death. Now, to enter into the gates of splendor, we must only trust Jesus. Trust Jesus. Turn to Him by faith. Isn't this good news for us today? God accomplished the work for Jacob, and God has accomplished the work for you and myself through His Son, Jesus. Here you have the sovereign grace of God in our salvation. We must only trust Jesus. Verse 24 continues, and Rebekah gives birth to twins. Verse 25, Esau came out first. He was hairy and red. Verse 26, Jacob came out second, and Jacob was holding Esau's heel. Jacob's holding Esau's heel here at birth is yet another foreshadow of the division to come between Jacob and Esau. Holding of the heel was as if to try to trip Esau up, to deceive his brother even from birth. And we get a story of this deception, of this division here at the end of this chapter. I'm going to read this final story, verses 27 through 34. Follow with me. When the boys grew up, Esau was a skillful hunter, a man of the field, while Jacob was a quiet man dwelling in tents. Isaac loved Esau because he ate of his game, but Rebekah loved Jacob. Once when Jacob was cooking stew, Esau came in from the field, and he was exhausted. And Esau said to Jacob, "Let me eat some of that red stew, for I am exhausted." Therefore his name was called Edom. Jacob said, "Sell me your birthright now." Esau said, "I am about to die. Of what use is a birthright to me?" And Jacob said, "Swear to me now." So he swore to him and sold his birthright to Jacob. Then Jacob gave Esau bread and lentil stew, and he ate and he drank and he rose and went his way. Thus Esau despised his birthright. These final verses, look at these really shortly, we see our need for God's sovereign grace. We need Him to be sovereign, powerful, in control. We need Him to be gracious. Just note this story and note all of the sin in these short few verses. And let's just conclude with thanksgiving that God extends His sovereign grace to us. This is quite the story. The boys have grown up. Esau likes the outdoors and hunting. Jacob likes cooking and being in the home, indoor type of man. Verse 28 notes Isaac loved Esau because he ate of his game, but Rebekah loved Jacob. So parents have already chosen favorites. Not a good start. Esau comes in from a hunt, exhausted and hungry. And Jacob, rather than feed his brother, asked Esau to exchange his birthright for a bowl of soup. The birthright here refers to Esau's double portion of the inheritance. He gets a double portion of their father's inheritance as the firstborn son, as well as leadership, heir of the family. Now, let's be clear, Isaac was a very rich man. He would have been a billionaire in terms of today's money. And Esau, he takes the bait. He sells his birthright to Jacob. Billions of dollars, right, in our terms, for a bowl of soup. Look at all the selfish sinfulness here. Isaac and Rebekah have chosen favorites. Jacob, rather than help his brother, deceives Esau in a weak, hungry, tired state. And Esau settles for short-term gratification. Just a side note here, you should be very careful with the decisions you make, actions you take, things you say in moments of weakness, tiredness, and hunger. Yesterday, it was late, hadn't eaten all day, like 1 p.m. I was really hungry. And in that weak and hungry state, I went to McDonald's and I bought the whole thing. And I felt terrible all day. That's what happens when we make decisions in that type of state. Look at verse 34. Then Jacob gave Esau bread and lentil stew, and he ate and drank and rose and went his way. Thus Esau despised his birthright. That choppy quickness you hear of the final verse is to emphasize Esau's thoughtless action and his instant regret. For example, I went to McDonald's, I ate, I drank, I rose, I went my way, and I despise McDonald's. Esau instantly regretted what he had done. If you remember, as God foretold, the older will serve the younger. And here we are. I want to note in these final verses here, there is no mention of God. He seems to take a step back. And sinful chaos drowns the end of the chapter. This is a picture of us in our sin, separated from God. We need God's sovereign grace. We need Him. The invitation of this chapter is for us to lift our eyes to a higher view of God. He is mighty, powerful, gracious. He is with you. And He works in His power toward you in loving grace. Romans 8:28, one of my favorite verses, says, "We know that for those who love God, all things work together for good, for those who are called to live according to His purposes." For God to work all things for your good, He must be sovereign. And for God to want to work all things for your good, He must be gracious. And He is. Let me leave you with Isaiah 46 and verse 9. Our confidence, our trust, our prayers, our salvation in the highs and in the lows of this life rest firmly in the God who says this here. Listen to these words as I move to pray. He says, "I am God, and there is no other. I am God, and there is none like me, declaring the end from the beginning, and from ancient times things not yet done, saying, my counsel shall stand, and I will accomplish all my purpose." Let's go to Him in prayer.